My name is Jennifer Aniston, 31 years old, an interior architect living in Boulder, Colorado. The story I'm about to tell doesn't begin with some dramatic event. It started on what seemed like an ordinary Thanksgiving evening, where everyone laughed and chatted around the dinner table, until my mother set down the pumpkin pie and said those words. "Sometimes, I wish Ellie was our only child." The whole table burst into laughter except me. I didn't get angry, I didn't cry. I just put my fork down and quietly said, "Well, Mom, you might just get that wish sooner than you think." They thought I was joking. But a week later, that sentence became reality and their perfect little world started to crumble, piece by piece. Have you ever felt like the outsider in your own family? Tell me where you're watching this from so I'll know that maybe, just maybe, we're not alone in this. That day, Colorado was so cold the air itself seemed to freeze into white mist. Inside the suburban house in Fort Collins, the scent of roasted turkey mixed with cinnamon and nutmeg drifted through the dining room. Warm yellow light glowed over the long wooden table, where the hand-embroidered tablecloth my mother had treasured for decades was once again brought out for Thanksgiving. I sat at the far left end of the table, the usual spot no one ever claimed, as if that seat existed for the person present enough to be polite, but never meant to be the center. Ellie, my younger sister, sat across from me, her golden curls perfectly styled, wearing a cream wool dress that framed her slender figure. She had just returned from Los Angeles after taking some time off to focus on her novel. A phrase my mother loved to repeat with pride, as if our family housed a literary icon. My father, Michael, sat at the head of the table, nodding and smiling while Mom retold the story about Ellie's small magazine interview in California. I stayed still, quietly slicing my turkey, smiling at the right moments, nodding at the right cues, and staying silent in all the right ways. When dessert was brought out, my mother placed the pumpkin pie on the table, the dish she always took the most pride in. "Family recipe," she would say, though in reality it came from the shop down the street with a bit of whipped cream added for a homemade touch. She poured the wine, lifted her glass, her voice a little hoarse with excitement. "I just want to say how grateful I am this year. For Ellie, for her creativity, her heart, her courage to chase her dreams." She glanced at me, her eyes flickering as if trying to remember my name, then added awkwardly, "And for Jennifer, of course, for always being so reliable." I smiled and said thank you. Reliable, a word that sounds like praise but in our family meant I was good at standing still and enduring. Then she cut the pie, served the slices, and as always began one of her half-joke, half-truth comments. "You know," she said lightly, her voice even, "sometimes I wish Ellie was our only child. Life would be so much simpler." The words rang out over the clinking of silverware and the sound of wine being poured into glasses. A brief silence passed, then the whole table burst into laughter. Ellie laughed the loudest, her voice high and clear like crystal glasses colliding. "Don't worry, Mom," she said, half joking, half not, "we love her anyway." My father shook his head, chuckling, and patted my mother's hand. "Diane, don't start." My mother only shrugged, her eyes glinting with that strange delight, the kind of joy someone feels when they've spoken out loud what they've always thought, and no one dares to object. I said nothing. I simply set my fork down slowly. Inside, a cold, hollow space opened, not pain, but the strange quiet of an old wound being touched again. I looked around the table. The people I loved, the ones I had sent money to help fix their roof last year, the ones for whom I had bought Ellie a new laptop so she could write her stories. All of them were laughing. And me, the one who had spent her whole life trying to prove she was worthy, sat there like a stranger in her own family. I took a sip of water, then lifted my head, my voice low but clear. "Well, Mom, you might just get that wish sooner than you think." The air in the room dropped instantly. Laughter died out as if someone had cut the sound. My mother froze, the knife poised midair above the pie. Ellie looked at me, her mouth still curved but her eyes flickering. My father cleared his throat, ready to change the subject, but no one picked it up. Only the ticking of the wall clock counted slowly in a room thick with cinnamon and silence. I didn't need to say anything else. In my mind, the pieces finally clicked into place. The quiet dinners, the forgotten birthdays, the jokes that sliced into me while I forced myself to laugh them off. I understood now that what they had just said wasn't a joke. It was the truth they had carried for years, wrapped in wine and laughter. And in that moment, I knew I was finished with all of it. I smiled softly, stood up, cleared my plate, and said quietly, "Thank you for dinner. The pie was great." My voice was steady, no trembling, no anger, only one thing remained: clarity. As I stepped out of that house, snow had begun to fall. The porch light glowed against the thin sheet of first snow, casting a faint reflection across my car window. I sat behind the wheel, my hands resting on it, listening to the wind rush through the trees and thinking, if they truly wanted a life without me, then maybe it was time to let them have it. And in the freezing breath of that Colorado winter night, I felt it clearly: something in me had ended. And something else, stronger, had just begun. I drove out of Fort Collins as the clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. Snow was falling thick, covering the road in white, and the cold wind blew across the mountains like the long exhale of winter. My headlights cut through the fog, revealing swirls of snow spinning in the air before disappearing again, like every effort I had made over the last 31 years appearing, glimmering for a moment, then vanishing into silence. The road back to Boulder was so familiar I could have driven it with my eyes closed, but tonight everything felt different. Every curve, every sign, every dark stretch of highway felt as though I were driving through the years of my own past, the years I spent trying to prove my worth to people who never really wanted to see it. The steady rhythm of the wipers, the crunch of the tires on snow, and the soft music on the radio blended into a mournful song I had never heard before. I didn't cry. What I felt now wasn't the sharp pain I had grown used to, but a deep emptiness, as if someone had carved out a hollow space in my chest and left it to freeze over. I thought of my mother Diane and the way she had looked at me at a family wedding last year when I wore a simple navy blue dress. She glanced at me and said loudly enough for a few people nearby to hear, "Sweetheart, next time pick something a little more expensive, this one looks cheap." I remembered forcing a smile, joking back, "I like simplicity, Mom." But later that night, looking at the group photos, I saw her eyes on Ellie, praising her for being elegant and sophisticated. I still remember that tightness in my throat, not from embarrassment, but from realizing that no matter how hard I tried, in my mother's eyes, I would always just be the faded shadow standing next to the child she was truly proud of. Then I thought of my father, a quiet, steady man who could wound someone with a single offhand remark. When I was 26, after my firm won the bid to design the interiors of a major hotel in Denver, I called home with the news, hoping to hear him say, "Well done, I'm proud of you." But he was silent for a few seconds and then said, "That's good. But Ellie has more talent than you. She writes so well. If she tries, she'll probably be famous soon." The words were as light as air, yet I remember standing frozen in the middle of my office, the phone still in my hand, my eyes staring out the glass window at the Denver skyline blazing bright against the night. The lights were dazzling, but not enough to erase the smallness spreading through my chest. I also remembered the time Ellie used my credit card to buy a MacBook. When the bank sent the bill, I thought it was a system error. I called to ask, and Ellie said breezily, "Oh, you must have sent me that card by mistake before, sorry." I thought it was mine. I knew it was a lie, but my mother stepped in immediately. "Let it go, Jennifer. Your sister didn't mean it. She needs a laptop to write." So I stayed silent again, paid the bill myself, and told myself that one day they would realize I was always the one holding everything together. But sitting here in my car, in the middle of this white snow night, I understood that day would never come. I had spent my entire life trying to make them proud when they had never intended to be proud of me. I used to think I was a victim of a toxic family, but tonight I realized I was also at fault because I chose to stay. I chose silence when I was insulted, chose to help when I was taken advantage of, chose to stay when I should have left. I had taught them that I would always endure, that I was the place they could unload their burdens and walk away without looking back. I had turned myself into the shadow they needed, and when that shadow became too obedient, they forgot it was also a human being. I turned on the heater, glanced at the rearview mirror, and saw my own reflection blurred in the glow of the streetlights. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me anymore, a tired face, empty eyes, lips pressed tight as if holding back a lifetime of unsaid words. And then, I laughed. A laugh that was both sad and strangely light. Because at last, I understood. They had said, "We wish Ellie was our only child," but in truth, that no longer mattered. From this moment on, I would make that wish real. They wanted a life without me? Fine, they would have it. As I merged onto the highway toward Boulder, the snow came down heavier. The sky was pitch black, the only light a faint glow from my headlights reflecting off the white ice. Slowly, I spoke aloud, my voice echoing in the small cabin of the car. If they want me to disappear, I'll disappear. But not because I lost. I pulled into a gas station and stepped out. The air sliced against my skin like a blade. Tilting my head back, I watched the snow fall and melt on my hands, leaving tiny trails of water. For the first time in my life, I felt peace in the cold. I no longer wanted to prove anything. No longer wanted to be the good daughter, the sacrificing sister, the reliable woman. I just wanted to be myself, even if that meant walking away from everything. I returned to Boulder through that white snow night with a completely different state of mind. The next morning, as the sun crept through the window of my apartment, I already knew what I had to do. No more circles. No more, just this one time. I sat at the kitchen table, poured myself a black coffee, and watched the steam rise from the ceramic mug. In the soft hum of the heater, I opened my laptop and began typing out each transfer with an icy calm. Every click of the mouse was a snip of the scissors cutting through the cord that had tied me to that family. First came the joint account I had been depositing money into every month to support my parents. Since the age of 25, I had been transferring a third of my income into it, believing I was fulfilling my duty. But now, staring at the numbers on the screen, the amount not small at all, enough for them to live comfortably if they managed it wisely, I felt a strange sadness. Not regret, but the sudden realization that all these years, I had never once asked myself if I even wanted to do it. I withdrew the entire balance back into my personal account, clicked confirm, and canceled the automatic transfers. A notification appeared. Transfer completed. I inhaled deeply, feeling as though I had just closed the first door. Next was the home repair loan I had co-signed. Last year, my parents' old roof had leaked badly after a storm. Their credit score wasn't high enough for a loan, so I had signed on so they would be approved for the repairs. I opened my email, found the contract, then called the company. A woman's voice came through the phone. "Mrs. Aniston, you want to cancel the guarantee? The final disbursement hasn't been processed yet." I answered calmly, "Yes. I'm no longer responsible for that loan. From now on, please work directly with the homeowners." She hesitated for a moment, then confirmed. When I hung up, my heart was pounding not with fear, but with the feeling of having loosened yet another cord around my neck. The same with my mother's car. Last year, she said her old one had a bad engine and wasn't safe to drive. I bought her a new SUV, put it under my name, and lent it to her so she could use my insurance and pay lower premiums. Now I drafted a letter to the insurance company, transferring the legal ownership back to myself and requesting the cancellation of the old policy at the end of the month. I wrote the letter carefully, without a single word of reproach, just cold, legal language. Each word was an assertion. From today on, I'm taking back what's mine, no longer lending unconditionally. I didn't do all of this in a single day. Each morning when I woke up, I loosened one more link in the chain. I cleared out my old apartment in Boulder, where I had lived for 6 years, piece by piece, memory by memory. I listed it for sale, paid off the bank loan, and used what was left to search for someplace entirely new. Telluride appeared on my computer screen as I scrolled a small town tucked deep in the mountains of southwest Colorado, nearly 6 hours from Fort Collins. The photos showed snow-blanketing wooden cabins, narrow roads leading up the ridges, sunlight spilling through the pine trees, everything like an invitation. There, no one would know who I was. No one would know me as Ellie's sister. I could just be Jennifer, a person without burdens, without labels. I rented a small wooden cabin on a hillside overlooking the valley. Inside, it was simple but warm. Pinewood walls, wide windows, a tiny kitchen, a stone fireplace. I imagined myself making coffee there in the mornings, watching snow fall outside the window. The thought filled me with a strange peace. I began packing my things, the blueprints, the architecture books, the few photographs I actually liked. I left behind the false gifts, the keepsakes that carried the weight of being overlooked. Each box sealed was another chapter of my life closing. The night before leaving Boulder, I opened my email and wrote a single line to my parents. No explanations, no defenses, no anger. Just a message as cold as ice. You wished for a life without me. Congratulations. Starting today, it's yours. I stared at the words on the screen, my hand resting on the mouse. I remembered every time I'd bowed my head, every transfer I'd made, every smile I'd forced. They rose and faded like steam on glass. Then I clicked, send. A soft sound chimed. The message was gone. I shut the laptop and stood up. Outside the window, the snow was falling thicker now, blanketing the quiet street like a white quilt. I stepped out onto the balcony and took a deep breath. The icy air rushed into my lungs, but for the first time, it felt like I was inhaling freedom. I knew tomorrow wouldn't be easy. They would call, they would text, they would try every way they could to pull me back. But this time, I wasn't going back. I had taken my voice back. I had made their wish come true, not to punish them, but to save myself. And in the cold of that last night in Boulder, I understood this wasn't an ending at all, but the beginning of another life, a life I would build with my own hands, no longer as a shadow beside Ellie, no longer as the sister who carries everything. Just Jennifer, a free woman, at last. A week after I sent the email, the first signs of chaos began to show, not where I was living now, but where I had left. I knew because my phone wouldn't stop vibrating, though I never picked up. My mother's number, then my father's, then unknown numbers. I knew Ellie must have borrowed from someone else. I watched the calls flash across the screen and let them sink into silence. I no longer needed to explain. Every word I had ever spoken, every plea, every effort to prove myself had been thrown out the window by them long ago. Now they would have to live with the wish they had spoken aloud, a life without me. On Monday morning, I received an automatic email from the bank, a copy of the old statement for the account I'd once shared with my parents to help them cover the monthly mortgage. This time, a red line stood out. Automatic payment failed, insufficient funds. I let out a small laugh, not out of glee, but because it was exactly as I'd predicted. Every month, I had quietly topped off the shortfall because their retirement income wasn't enough to cover the bills. Now that mortgage had no one standing behind it. The first shield had fallen. I could almost picture my mother panicking when the bank called, her voice trembling at the thought of losing the family home I had been helping to sustain all these years. 3 days later, another email arrived, this time from the insurance company. Since I had canceled the policy, the SUV my mother drove was no longer legally insured. I imagined she kept driving as usual until one cold afternoon when a police officer pulled her over for a routine check. I could see it so clearly, her in a heavy winter coat, hands trembling as she handed over the papers and received a ticket for driving without valid insurance. My mother, who had always prided herself on being the perfect household manager, had probably never imagined such a moment. Then came Ellie's turn. She called in the middle of the night, leaving a voicemail nearly 4 minutes long. I listened to it once just to confirm that she was still exactly who she'd always been. Confident, blaming, and dramatic. "You're so petty, Jennifer. I only wanted to borrow a little money to open my writing studio, but the bank said they couldn't approve it because you withdrew your guarantee. Do you know what that's done to me? Mom's been crying all day. Do you want to see us fall apart? Fine, you win. You've always been the cold one. I listened to that voice, a mix of anger and pleading, and realized I felt nothing. No pity, no fury, just absolute stillness. My father was next. He called repeatedly, leaving short messages, sometimes commanding, sometimes pleading. Call me back. This has gone too far. Your mother's falling apart, please come home. Stop acting like a child, Jennifer. Each word echoed in my head, and all I could think was, if only he knew how grown up I became the moment they kept treating me like a child, maybe he wouldn't have said that. I didn't delete the messages, I simply turned off notifications. Every missed call, every unheard voicemail became another brick in the wall of freedom I was building, the wall I had never dared to construct before. In Telluride, my life began to find its rhythm. Each morning, I woke early and opened the window to breathe in the crisp mountain air. The sunlight glistened on the snow, so bright it made my eyes squint. I bought a small wooden table and placed it by the window where I could work on freelance design projects. When I drew, time seemed to stop. No more ringing phones, no more voices filled with guilt or blame, just the sound of a pencil gliding across paper and the steady beat of my heart. I learned to listen to the silence, the sound I once feared, but which had now become the soundtrack of my rebirth. Meanwhile, in Fort Collins, the dominoes began to fall. I heard bits of news through my mother's old friend, Helen, who sent me an email asking, "Are you all right, Jennifer? Your mom doesn't look well. The house is under pressure from the bank, and Ellie's been gone for a few days. Your dad looks exhausted." I read the message quietly, then replied with just one line. "Thank you for checking on me, I'm fine." I didn't ask for more details because I already knew what was happening. My mother was likely calling me every day, blaming me for destroying the family, never realizing that I had simply stopped playing the role of their rescuer. They weren't falling apart because I left, they were falling apart because they never learned how to stand without someone holding them up. One evening, as I sat by the fireplace, my phone buzzed again. A new message from my mother. "Jennifer, please, come back. I know I said things I shouldn't have. Your father isn't eating, Ellie is falling apart. We need you. Stop acting like a child, please." I read that message over and over, word by word. Stop acting like a child. How ironic. They called me childish for doing the one thing an adult must eventually do: set boundaries. I didn't reply. I switched off my phone, set it on the table, and stepped out onto the porch. The night was dark, snow falling slowly, the moonlight turning the pine forest into liquid silver. I pulled on a wool sweater and sat down on the wooden chair, gazing up at the sky. No more anger, no more pain. Only stillness, the very thing I had once mistaken for loneliness but now recognized as the sign of freedom. I realized some lives only truly begin after you let everything collapse without rushing to save it. Somewhere out there, beyond the Colorado mountains, I knew Fort Collins was descending into chaos. And here I was, in my small cabin, learning how to breathe again. Every unanswered ring was a deeper breath. Every deleted email was a step closer to the life I had chosen. And in that silence, I understood something profound. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making someone else hurt, it's living so peacefully that their pain can no longer reach you. On my first morning in Telluride, I woke before the sun rose above the snow-covered peaks. The air was sharp and cold, slipping through the cracks of the window frame, carrying the faint scent of pine, the forest's quiet way of saying welcome. I opened the window and looked out at the valley below, still asleep beneath a layer of mist. I could hear the steady tapping of a woodpecker on an old tree, and somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a snowmobile tracing a thin line across the frozen ground. My cabin was small, but everything in it felt just right. A wooden table by the window, a low bookshelf propped up by two flat stones, a tiny kitchen that stayed warm thanks to the stone fireplace, and a hand-woven rug I'd found at a thrift store in town. I brewed a cup of coffee, the rich aroma rising in the air, and suddenly felt something unfamiliar: being in a place where no one knew my past, where no one expected me to save them, where my worth wasn't measured by the money I sent. I pulled out a chair and opened my laptop. The screen lit up with my teaching schedule. 3 basic studio classes for first-year architecture students from a community college in Denver, and a private workshop I had just launched on an online platform. I greeted them with a calm good morning and guided them through sketching shapes by hand before moving to digital tools, reminding them to find the natural light in their room before switching on lamps because real light will teach you more about space than any textbook ever could. Faces filled the small squares on my screen, curious, clumsy, but bright-eyed. When they held up their sketches to the webcam, I didn't just see lines and angles. I saw what architecture had always taught me, that inside every structure, there's a story waiting to be heard. During my lunch break, I turned to the old design drafts I had once stuffed into the bottom of a drawer, sketches I'd abandoned with excuses like no time or no budget, when in truth, I just hadn't been brave enough to make time for myself. I spread the paper across the table, sharpened the tip of my 2B pencil, and drew the horizon line of a single-story house opening toward a sloping hillside. I added a beam of light streaming from a skylight into the kitchen, imagining the warmth of afternoon sunlight spilling across the dining table, a space free from words that made anyone shrink. With every line I traced, my breathing grew lighter, as though the pencil itself was carving a hidden passage into a chest that hadn't taken a deep breath in years. Dusk came quickly in the mountains. When I stepped outside to take out the trash, I noticed the cabin next door flickering to life with a warm yellow glow. The door was half open, and a man with tousled brown hair and a thick down jacket was backing out carefully, cradling a massive tripod against his chest, a camera backpack bulging behind him. He fumbled and nearly tripped on the steps. I laughed softly, stepping over just in time to catch the edge of the tripod before it hit the porch. "Thanks," he exhaled, his cheeks flushed red from the cold, his voice deep and steady. "I'm Eric. Just rented this place for the month. I'm here to photograph the San Juan Range in winter." I introduced myself, gesturing toward the pine forest, rambling a few words about the cliff at the end of the trail where the sunset view was spectacular. He smiled. "I'm chasing the blue light before it disappears. It's funny, I used to think snow was just one color. Turns out it's a whole palette if you stand still long enough to see it." That line caught my attention. Someone willing to stand still long enough, that wasn't something you heard often in a world addicted to hurry. In the days that followed, we exchanged simple greetings across the porch. He was always leaving early, returning late, a tripod slung over his shoulder, while I stayed tangled in lesson plans and half-finished drawings. On Wednesday night, as the wind whistled through the gutters like a flute and the power flickered out across the area, I was feeding logs into the fire when I heard a gentle knock. Eric stood at the door, holding a kettle of boiling water and a packet of cocoa. "The power's out at my place too," he said with a grin. "I've got a camping stove, thought you might want a warm drink." We sat by the fireplace, the flames dancing against the stone, the scent of chocolate rich in the air, and the conversation found its own rhythm. Eric told me he was born in New Mexico, raised by his mother, and grew up with an old film camera she'd bought from a flea market. His biological father, he said, was nothing more than a name on a birth certificate. "I used to wait for him at vague meeting spots all through my childhood," Eric said, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Every time he didn't show up, my mom would teach me something. You can photograph a shadow that stretches as far as you want, but don't mistake it for a real person." I stayed quiet for a long while, feeling that sentence unlock a hidden drawer inside me. Then, as if drawn by a gentle pull, I began to tell him about Fort Collins, about the long dinner table, the store-bought pumpkin pie my mother gave. A touch of soul, and the words, "We wish Ellie was our only child." I didn't dramatize it or hold anything back. I spoke the way someone might place stones carefully, one by one, to rebuild a path that was once lost. Eric didn't interrupt. He only nodded, asking short questions just enough to let me know I was being truly heard. "Where was your body in that moment? How long did you keep trying? Have you forgiven yourself for staying?" I answered each one, saying aloud for the first time things I'd only ever thought during late-night drives through the snow. When I finished, the warmth in my face seemed to fade, replaced by a strange lightness, as if the slope I had been climbing my whole life had suddenly softened. I looked around the cabin, nothing had changed. The fire still burned, the mugs of cocoa still steamed, yet somehow the air felt larger by half a breath. In the days that followed, Eric invited me on short walks through the edge of the forest. He showed me how he waited for light, setting up the camera early, framing the shot, and then sitting still until the sky shifted tone in a way most eyes would never notice. Light is the first storyteller, he said. Photography is just choosing where to pause the story and keep a piece for yourself. I laughed and said architecture was the same. I just arranged the letters for light to pass through. We walked in silence for a long stretch, listening to snow fall soundlessly and the tap of a bird somewhere in the trees, like punctuation in a quiet sentence. With him, I didn't have to fill the silence to make someone comfortable. Silence was allowed to simply be silence. One evening, as the light faded, Eric invited me over to his cabin to see the photos he had just developed. The walls were lined with small frames, the jagged ridges of a mountain where the clouds had opened a gap, the shadows of pine trees stretching across a frozen lake like someone's outstretched arms, a ripple in the snow where the wind had carved a wave. I stood for a long time before one photograph of a small wooden house crouched in the middle of a vast white landscape. Tiny bird tracks dotted the roof, and a warm yellow glow filled its lone window like the eye of someone who stayed awake late. That house reminds me that there are still things in this world that stand firm, even when the wind changes, he said. I swallowed a strange gratitude, because it felt as though he had just spoken for me for my little cabin. That night, I sat at my desk and reopened the sketch titled A House for One. For the first time, I drew it as if it were meant for me. A window framing the western pines, a skylight above the kitchen to let the rain play its music, a reading nook just big enough for one person and an imaginary cat. In tiny letters, I wrote a note at the corner. Safe space where silence doesn't need permission. On some evenings, after long hours of teaching that left my throat dry, I would walk to the edge of the hill, breathe in the scent of pine, and listen to the faint cracking of distant ice, a soft reminder that everything is shifting, slowly but surely. My phone still buzzed now and then with a stray call or two. I kept it on silent, face down, like placing the final stone to block an old stream. From that distance, I could see a truth that no longer hurt. I no longer belonged to the place I had left. And strangely, the sadness that came with that realization felt light, almost tender. One evening, as we carried firewood inside before a snowstorm, Eric asked, without looking at me, "Do you think you'll ever go back?" I shook my head. "I'll go back to my own version of me, the one I abandoned for too long. As for them, probably not." He said nothing, only placed another log into the fire. In the crackle and pop of burning wood, I suddenly saw a truth I had never named before. Sometimes, family isn't where you were born, it's where you are finally seen. In Telluride, among the snow and the pines, between the tapping of woodpeckers and the steady breathing of a neighbor who knew how to wait for light, I began, for the first time, to feel myself taking shape. No longer a shadow of anyone. I stopped counting how many times they called, stopped measuring how often I had helped. Each morning I opened my eyes was a blank page. Each night I closed my door was a soft line written across it. Today, I lived on my own terms. And within that simplicity, a quiet rebirth was taking place, not loud, not performative, not in need of validation like an underground spring searching for a way out beneath the frozen ground. Slow, patient, and certain. 3 months passed since the day I left Fort Collins. Winter had faded, and the snow in Telluride was melting slowly, revealing the first patches of green grass beyond my cabin porch. My days found a calm, gentle rhythm, teaching in the morning, sketching in the afternoon, sharing tea and music with Eric at night. I no longer measured time through messages or bills, but through the changing light across the pines, pale green in the morning, golden at noon, violet gray by dusk. I almost forgot that somewhere out there, Fort Collins still existed with the people who once called me the extra child. But one March morning, as I was reviewing a student's architectural draft, a knock at the door startled me. The mail carrier stood there in a brown coat, holding a thick envelope stamped with the seal of a law office. I signed for it, a flicker of unease running through me, and opened it right there at the table. Inside was a formal letter, the tone rigid, full of legal phrasing. Dear Mrs. Jennifer Aniston, we represent Mountain West Credit Union. Recently, a mortgage application was submitted under your name, bearing a signature that matches the records we have on file. However, during verification, we discovered the applicant was Mrs. Diane Aniston, your mother. To ensure credit security and prevent fraud, please confirm whether you authorized this application. I froze. My hands trembled as I reached the last line. If we do not receive your authorization, the bank will proceed with an investigation into identity fraud. My mother. The woman who used to say, "We're family, don't keep score." The one who accused me of acting like a child when I cut contact. She had used my name, my signature, to borrow money to save the house, the very house whose mortgage I had quietly been covering for years. I sat down, my heart pounding. The rational part of me wanted to call a lawyer immediately, but emotionally, there was only a strange emptiness. I had thought I was used to betrayal, but when it came from the person who once sang me to sleep, it still pierced like the first time. I wasn't angry anymore. I only felt sorrow for a mother who chose deceit over humility, manipulation over simply learning how to apologize. I called my attorney in Denver and explained the situation. His voice was calm. You need to submit a formal statement disclaiming responsibility right away. This is a serious offense, and the bank may press charges if it isn't clarified. I heard myself respond, I understand, please go ahead. I don't want to prosecute them, I just want them to know I won't shield them anymore. When I hung up, I exhaled deeply. Outside, the pine trees swayed in the wind, their peace absurd against the storm now raging in Fort Collins. 2 days later, Eric placed a printed page on my table, something a friend had sent him. It was a social media post from Ellie, shared publicly on her account with over 3,000 followers. The first line, written in all caps, read, "My sister abandoned our family for money." Below it was a long string of half-truths and fabrications, that I had left my parents drowning in debt, that I cut off contact because I refused to help with a small amount, that I chose money over love. There was even an old photo of the two of us in the backyard, with Ellie's caption beneath it. Sometimes blood doesn't mean family. I read every word, not quickly, not avoiding. Beneath the post were hundreds of comments, split down the middle. Some offered sympathy, others piled on. But a few began to ask questions. If she was really that cold, how come your family lived so comfortably before? I didn't react. But in the small world of Fort Collins, the stories spread like wildfire. Old neighbors, high school classmates, they started piecing together the fragments they remembered. They recalled how I used to come home early every year to help my mother prepare for Thanksgiving, how my mother's new car had once been registered under my name, how I was the one who co-signed when they repaired their roof. All the truths that had long been buried under the illusion of family love began to surface, one by one. An old friend messaged me. People are talking about your mom at the cafe near your old house. They said she used your name to take out a loan. Everyone's shocked. I didn't reply. I simply closed my phone. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The truth was speaking for me. And then, just as it always happens with houses built on false foundations, everything truly began to collapse. My parents were investigated by the bank, their accounts were temporarily frozen. The house they had proudly claimed was almost paid off, turned out to be far more in debt than they realized. They began to fight. I heard it all from Helen, the neighbor who had been close to my mother for over 20 years, through an email she sent. Your mother blames your father for not stopping Ellie from overspending, and your father says your mother ruined everything by using your name for the loan. They yelled all night. I'm honestly afraid they might divorce. Her words were filled with disbelief, as though she couldn't comprehend how the once model Aniston family had become the town's scandal. Ellie, after her post backfired, deleted her account and vanished from social media. I heard she moved in with her boyfriend in California, taking with her those unfinished manuscripts that were never published. My mother withdrew from her friends, and my father quit his job at the accounting firm because he couldn't stand the whispers behind his back. So she'd been living off her eldest daughter's money all these years, people said. And they were right. They finally had the life without me they'd wished for and mocked me about for so long. Now they were living it completely. A life without the one who paid the bills, without the one who carried the responsibility, without the hands that had held everything together under the name of duty. A life where comfort no longer had anyone left to sustain it. I felt no joy, no sense of vindication. Only a strange silence, like standing outside a building I had once helped construct and watching it crumble because its foundation had long since rotted. One evening, as Eric and I sat on the porch, watching the mountain peaks turn gold beneath the setting sun, he asked, "Do you feel satisfied?" I shook my head. No. I just feel lighter. The truth is finally free and so am I. He nodded quietly, saying nothing more. We sat in stillness, listening to the wind weave through the forest, the scent of pine and snow blending in the air. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, my heart carried no trace of guilt. They had gotten what they wanted, a life without me. And just as I had once said, it was crumbling. But for me, their collapse was not an ending, but a rebirth. Because sometimes you have to let an old house fall so that the light can finally find its way in. After everything, on an afternoon when the first spring winds began to move through the pines on the slopes of Telluride, carrying the scent of resin and damp earth after rain, the sky broke into a soft Sunday. The snow was almost gone now, revealing small shoots of green grass around the cabin. I was sitting by the window, adjusting a few design sketches, when I heard the engine of the mail truck down the hill. The mail carrier raised a cream-colored envelope and waved. "For Miss Aniston." "Oh." I stepped outside to take it, and as soon as I saw the rounded, slightly leaning handwriting on the front, my heart sank. The uneven letters, slanting, left my mother's handwriting. I stood on the porch for a long time, the envelope light yet heavy as though it held a stone inside. It had been more than half a year since I sent that last email, the last time I'd heard their voices. Since then, only a handful of missed calls and deleted messages I never opened. I had thought the cord between us had truly snapped. But now, holding the letter in my hands, I could feel it still there, not as a chain anymore, but as a thin thread of something left unsaid. I went back inside, brewed a cup of mint tea, and sat at the wooden table. I stared at the envelope for a few more seconds, then gently opened it. Inside were 3 handwritten pages. The first line made me stop breathing. "Jennifer, my daughter. If you're reading this letter, it means I've lost the courage to call. I know I no longer deserve to hear your voice." The handwriting trembled, ink smudged in places as if it had absorbed tears. I kept reading. "Your father and I were so blind, Jennifer. We thought love meant control, that criticism would make you better, when in truth it was only selfishness dressed up as care. I was always proud of Ellie because she was weak and needed protecting, and I forgot that you needed love too, no matter how strong you seemed. I taught you to endure instead of to be understood. And when you disappeared, this house became so empty I finally realized the only person who had ever truly held everything together was you." I stopped reading and looked out the window. Sunlight slanted through the pine branches, scattering shimmering patterns across the table. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply. The forest was as quiet as ever, only my heart beating one slow, heavy rhythm. Then I turned to the next page. "Your father is no longer the same. Since the bank came, he hardly leaves the house. The doctor says it's depression. He barely speaks now, just sits on the porch staring at the road where you used to drive home for the holidays. Ellie has moved into a small apartment in the city, unemployed and saying she's going to rewrite her life. I don't blame anyone anymore. I don't even have the strength to argue. I've sold the house. They came and took down the curtains you sewed back in college. I've kept a few things, the bowl you broke but glued back together, the photo of all of us in the apple orchard, and the drawing of your wooden house. Now, looking back, I understand. You weren't just drawing walls. You were drawing a dream of a place where you could be yourself. Here the handwriting began to tilt and waver. I could picture my mother sitting at the old dining table, the yellow lamp casting light on her tired face, her hand trembling around the pen. I read on slowly, afraid that any sound might shatter the fragile moment. I'm sorry, Jennifer. There aren't words enough to undo the years I made you feel invisible. But I hope that, if someday you read this letter, you'll know I finally see it. Even if it's late, I still want to say what I should have said long ago. I'm proud of you. Not because you sent money, not because you were accomplished, but because you dared to live true to yourself. I wish you could forgive me, but if you can't, I understand. Just know that I will carry this regret for the rest of my life. The last page held only one small line, the letters shrinking as though whispered. Be happy, Jennifer, I love you. I set the paper down on the table and stared into the quiet space in front of me. The tea had gone cold, the faint scent of mint drifting in the air. I didn't cry. Strangely, the tears no longer knew how to find their way out. There was only stillness deep, like the bottom of a spring lake. I thought of that woman, the one who had spent years demanding that I become the perfect version of her dream, then spent the rest of her life realizing that all her daughter ever needed was to be loved as she was. I didn't resent her anymore. In truth, I felt compassion. Maybe, in her own way, she too had once been a child who grew up with a distorted understanding of love and unknowingly passed it on to me. I folded the letter not with the precision I used for work documents, but gently, as if it were something fragile that might tear. I didn't plan to reply. Not out of anger, but because I knew every word that needed to be said had already been written just too late. I took out a small wooden box where I kept things I couldn't throw away. A photo from my college days, the ticket from the first design exhibition I paid for with my own money, and now, this letter. I placed it inside, closed the lid, and put it away in the drawer. Not locked, just out of sight. That afternoon, when I stepped onto the porch, the wind had shifted. Eric was out front, photographing the sky. The last light of the day spilled across the snow like diluted honey. He looked up and asked softly, "News from Fort Collins?" I nodded with a small smile. "Just a letter." He didn't ask more, only turned his camera toward the setting sun. I followed his lens, watching the glowing orb blur and fade into violet clouds. In that moment, I understood I had just closed a chapter not with anger, but with grace. Spring comes late in Telluride. Snow still clings to the mountain slopes while the valley below begins to turn green. Each morning, sunlight filters through the pines, glimmering on the dew like crystals. I've started a new ritual, waking early, brewing coffee, opening the window, and watching how the light changes color across the wooden walls. Sometimes I think, if someone had told me happiness could be this simple, maybe I wouldn't have needed to endure so much pain. But then I realize it's the cracks that let the light in. Eric often came by early in the morning, carrying a wooden toolbox and sketches he'd captured through his camera. "I want to help you rebuild this house," he said one day, just as the last snow began to melt. "Using real pine wood the kind sunlight can pass through in the morning." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he looked at me seriously. "This house deserves to be a place of rebirth, not just for you, but for anyone who's ever needed a space to begin again." End of 7. I was quiet for a moment, then nodded. And so, from the early days of April, we began rebuilding the little cabin, not to change it completely, but to let it become a more mature version of itself. Still the same cabin, but with a new breath. The pine beams were lifted and set into place, one by one. I learned how to hold a hammer, drive nails, measure corners, small tasks that brought a strange kind of peace to my mind. Eric rebuilt the west-facing window frame, where the sunset poured in every evening. I redid the floors, choosing a lighter wood so every step would echo with the warmth of life. When we started re-roofing, Eric joked, "If you listen closely, you'll hear your own voice in every strike of the hammer." I looked up at him, sunlight glinting in his warm brown eyes, and suddenly I understood some people don't come into your life to save you. They come to witness you saving yourself. 3 weeks later, the house was finished. It wasn't big, it wasn't elaborate, but it had something most expensive homes never do: sincerity. The small living room opened onto the porch, and the walls were adorned with Eric's landscape photographs: the winter pines, the melting ice of a lake, and the blue light he had once told me about. Beside them was my workspace, where the blueprint for Healing Home hung: the first house I ever designed for myself. Together, we decided to open a small studio. He would handle photography and media, and I would take charge of design and teaching. We named it Atelier, the Studio of Light. At first, only a few tourists wandered in, curious about what we were doing. But soon, people seeking a place to rest their hearts began to arrive. A photographer who had lost his partner. A retired teacher who wanted to learn how to grow flowers. An architecture student struggling through burnout. They came, stayed for a few days, and left with softer eyes and lighter steps. I taught them not only about design, but about emotion within space: how the way light moves through a room can change the soul of its occupant, how the sound of wind or the scent of wood can bring calm. I started an online course called Designing for Healing Spaces: Architecture for Healing. In every session, I told my own story, not as a tale of suffering, but as a reminder that the first home we must build is always the one within ourselves. Eric often sat quietly at the back of the class, adjusting the lighting or recording the session, smiling whenever I mentioned the word healing. He said I had a gift for turning pain into art. I simply replied, maybe because I'm not afraid of it anymore. In the evenings, we would sit together on the porch steps, sipping tea, watching the moonlight settle over the forest. He would talk about his travels, and I would talk about my students. No loneliness could exist between two people who had learned the grace of being silent together. One early summer morning, I picked up the camera, a gift from Eric, and took a photo on the porch. The two of us smiling, the newly built pine cabin glowing behind us in the sunlight. I stared at the picture for a long while, then opened my laptop and began typing an email. The address: Diane Aniston, the one my mother had used for years. I didn't know if she still checked it, but I typed each word slowly, as if writing to my own heart. Mom. I found peace. I hope someday you do too. Nothing more. No blame, no long farewell. I attached the photo and pressed send. A soft whoosh echoed from the speakers, and the screen went blank. I looked out the window. Sunlight was already spilling across the grass. It didn't matter whether the email reached her or not. Some messages don't need a reply to have meaning. That afternoon, Eric and I walked along the mountain trail. The air was warm, and wild purple flowers bloomed along the path. He held my hand, saying nothing, and in that silence, I realized I had truly forgiven them. Not through words, but through the absence of the need to prove anything anymore. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about erasing the past, it's about being able to look at it without pain. 3 years have passed since the day I arrived in Telluride. Time, like the spring snow melting over the ridges, has quietly settled over the scars, not to erase them, but to make them part of the landscape. Life here moves slowly, peacefully. Each day, I understand a little more about what being at peace truly means. I'm no longer the woman who drove through a snowstorm trying to escape her pain. I'm the woman who stayed, who built her own warmth, a life that no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. Eric and I had been through 3 winters, 3 springs, and hundreds of bright mornings in the White Valley. Together, we expanded the studio, teaching, photographing, and sharing our journey of healing through space and light. Atelier slowly became a small sanctuary for those searching to find themselves again, people who, like me once, carried old wounds, were told they weren't enough, or were silenced inside their own homes. Every time someone walked through our door, I saw a reflection of myself in them: cautious eyes, hesitant steps, and then, gradually, the return of a genuine smile. In our 3rd winter, Eric proposed. It was snowing lightly that day, the flakes dancing through the air like a wordless symphony. He had built a frame out of pine wood, and inside it was a photograph I had taken during our first year together: the small wooden cabin we built, sunlight streaming through the doorway, me standing there smiling. holding a cup of coffee. Beneath the photo, he had written, "Marry me, let's keep building together." I laughed through tears before I even realized they'd fallen. I didn't need to think. I simply nodded. The wedding took place at the end of March, on the snowy hill behind our studio, where the sunset bathed the valley in gold. Friends, students, and former guests of Luminatelier came, bringing wildflowers, candles, and soft wishes. There was no loud music, only the wind, laughter, and the quiet whisper of snow. I wore a simple white dress, a few pine sprigs at the waist. Eric wore a gray suit, holding a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked that morning. When I stepped out, the crowd fell silent not because of the dress, but because of the atmosphere. It was warm, serene, as if the entire world was smiling with us. Ellie didn't come. I had expected that. She didn't reply to the invitation, only left a short message online. "I wish you happiness, sis. We're just not meant to stand in the same story anymore." I read it quietly, feeling neither anger nor sadness. Sometimes, distance is the kindest form of love between two people who have hurt each other too much. Mom was different. A week before the wedding, I received a package. Inside was a letter, the handwriting still trembling, still familiar. "Jennifer, I heard you're getting married. I won't be there, maybe my presence would only make things harder for you. But I want you to know that I'm proud. You found something I never knew how to keep. Peace. I wish you happiness. And if you can, please forgive us, so I can finally rest my heart. I love you." I read the letter in the living room, the fire flickering softly beside me. Eric stood next to me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. I didn't speak, I just nodded, folded the letter carefully, and placed it into the wooden box where I kept all the things that had already found their closure. Forgiveness doesn't need a ceremony. Sometimes, a silent blessing sent across the distance is enough. That evening, Telluride was breathtakingly beautiful. The sky was pale blue like silk, the snow glittering under the last rays of sunlight. Friends gathered around us in a wide circle. Eric looked at me, his eyes calm and steady. When the officiant asked, "Do you, Jennifer Aniston, take this man to be your husband?" I smiled, my voice trembling but strong. "With all that I've been and all that I've learned, yes, I do." After the ceremony, when everyone had drifted away, Eric and I stayed behind on the hill. I looked down at the valley below, where the last golden light shimmered across the snow. The world was so still it felt like a dream. I stepped up to the small wooden platform where the microphones still stood and looked at the faces gathered below. There's something I've learned, something I wish I had known sooner. Sometimes, we spend years trying to earn love from the wrong people. We try to fit ourselves into rooms that were never built for us. Until one day, silence teaches us, you don't have to stay where you're unseen, you can walk away, you can start again. And that's not failure, that's freedom. No one spoke. Only the sound of the wind and the soft crunch of snow beneath someone's shoes. I looked around and met the eyes of those standing before me, glimmering, tearful, silent. Some bowed their heads, others held the hands of the people beside them. I knew that each of them carried their own kind of wound. And maybe, just maybe, in that moment, they saw a piece of themselves in my story. Afterward, I took the bouquet, lavender mixed with small white blossoms, and walked toward the hill. The snow was soft, and the pale gold of sunset brushed gently across my shoulders. I knelt down and placed the bouquet on the snow. "For the girl who once thought she wasn't enough," I whispered. "You made it home, Helma." Eric wrapped his arms around me, and together we watched the sun sink behind the mountains. The world was so still I could hear my own heartbeat. No echoes of the past, no ghosts of the house in Fort Collins, only the present, quiet, light, and entirely mine. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the music faded, I stepped out onto the porch alone. The wind was soft, and flakes of snow still drifted lazily from the sky. In the distance, the lights from other cabins shimmered like low stars. I thought back on my journey from the invisible daughter to the woman strong enough to choose silence, and finally, to the one who learned to smile and forgive. Life had come full circle, closing in the same place where I had once lost myself. A small sparrow landed on the railing, tilting its head at me. I smiled. Maybe the universe knows when we've learned the lesson we were meant to. I turned back inside, where Eric was taking down the strings of lights from the windows, the glow reflecting softly in his eyes. I walked up behind him and wrapped my arms around his waist. He turned and asked gently, "What are you thinking about?" I smiled. That they once wished they had a perfect daughter. He raised an eyebrow, half curious, half teasing. And did they get her? I looked out the window, where the moonlight touched the pure white snow, and whispered. They wished they had one daughter. And in the end, they did. The one who finally learned to love herself. I leaned my head on his shoulder, eyes closed. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pines, carrying the faint scent of snow and lavender. Inside, the fire crackled quietly, its light flickering against the walls like memories dissolving into peace. I no longer needed to close the past, it had already closed itself, sealed gently by my own calm. And in that stillness, between the snow and the fading light, I finally understood love isn't something we find in others, it's something we build within ourselves. And when we find it, even in a small cabin in the mountains, we've already found everything. One early summer morning, I picked up the camera, a gift from Eric, and took a photo on the porch, the two of us smiling, the newly built pine cabin glowing behind us in the sunlight. I stared at the picture for a long while, then opened my laptop and began typing an email. The address. Diane. Aniston at, the one my mother had used for years. I didn't know if she still checked it, but I typed each word slowly, as if writing to my own heart. Mom. I found peace. I hope someday you do too. Nothing more. No blame, no long farewell. I attached the photo and pressed send. A soft whoosh echoed from the speakers, and the screen went blank. I looked out the window. Sunlight was already spilling across the grass. It didn't matter whether the email reached her or not. Some messages don't need a reply to have meaning. That afternoon, Eric and I walked along the mountain trail. The air was warm, and wild purple flowers bloomed along the path. He held my hand, saying nothing, and in that silence, I realized I had truly forgiven them. Not through words, but through the absence of the need to prove anything anymore. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about erasing the past, it's about being able to look at it without pain. 3 years have passed since the day I arrived in Telluride. Time, like the spring snow melting over the ridges, has quietly settled over the scars, not to erase them, but to make them part of the landscape. Life here moves slowly, peacefully. Each day, I understand a little more about what being at peace truly means. I'm no longer the woman who drove through a snowstorm trying to escape her pain. I'm the woman who stayed, who built her own warmth, a life that no longer needs to prove anything to anyone.